Welcome to the next installment of my video lecture series for microeconomic principles. And in this particular video lecture, I'm going to be taking a look at some of the potential test problems for test number 1. This is on the list that I've emailed out to students. And here we're going to be looking at this particular question right here, starting with the market in equilibrium. Graphically illustrate the change in equilibrium price and quantity for the following scenario: an increase/decrease. So I could ask you either an increase or a decrease in income for a normal/inferior, which means I can ask you for the change for a normal versus an inferior good. Explain your answer in detail. So again, this is your starting point for any problem graphically that asks you to start with a market in equilibrium. As you can see, we have a downward sloping demand curve, an upward sloping supply curve. Where they intersect gives you the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Let me get these all highlighted again. So we have the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So we have a downward sloping demand curve because the law of demand states that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And we have an upward sloping supply curve because the law of supply states that there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. And where they intersect is where the equilibrium in the marketplace occurs. So let's take a look at the scenario where we have an increase in income for a normal good. So we're going to look at an increase in income for a normal good. An increase in income is going to affect the demand curve. So we know the demand curve is going to physically shift its location, and we need to know which direction it's going to shift in. If we have an increase in income for a normal good, that is going to cause the demand curve to shift to the right. There's a positive relationship between demand and income for a normal good. So let me actually label this as D0 to denote that this is the original demand curve. And we just draw in a new demand curve that is to the right of the original demand curve. And let me change that so it's a solid line. So we have a new demand curve. I'm just going to copy and paste this. It's easier than retyping it and doing the formatting, etc. And it might be very helpful for your illustration to put in arrows to just distinguish that the demand curve or the direction of the shift of the demand curve, like that. So here is the original demand curve. The equilibrium occurs where the original demand curve intersects the original supply curve, so that's the equilibrium. When we have an increase in income for a normal good, this causes the demand curve to shift to the right, so this is our new demand curve. And the new equilibrium is going to occur where the new demand curve intersects the original supply curve. So I can draw in a line here and a line here, and I will change them to dotted lines to make it consistent. And I will just cut and paste or copy and paste. And I will make this the original price, P0. I will make this Q0, so we have our original equilibrium. Make sure you're comfortable with that if you're going to illustrate a change, that you denote what the original price and quantity were and what the new price and quantity were. So I'll make that P1 for the new equilibrium, and let me copy and paste that over, or duplicate and move that over, Q1. So what actually occurs? So here's our original supply and demand curves, and here is the original equilibrium price and quantity. With an increase in income for a normal good, the demand curve shifts to the right. So we have a shifting of the demand curve, and the new equilibrium is going to occur where the new demand curve intersects the original supply curve. That gives us a new equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. And what occurs? This causes the equilibrium price to increase, and the equilibrium quantity to also increase. So that's how you work on that problem if you're asked to start with an equilibrium, starting with a market in equilibrium, and you have an increase in income for a normal good. This graph and the writing of this looks exactly the same if we were to decrease income for an inferior good. So graphically, an increase in income for a normal good and the change in the equilibrium is identical to a decrease in income for an inferior good. So if you were asked for a decrease in income for an inferior good, there's an inverse relationship between the demand of an inferior good and income. So a decrease in income would cause the demand curve to shift to the right, and we would see an increase in the price of this product and an increase in the quantity, equilibrium quantity of this particular product. So we handled those two scenarios. Let's take a look at the scenario where we have a increase in income for an inferior good. And let me just rewrite these for you. Change this around slightly. So we're going to change this new equilibrium and make that the original equilibrium. I'm sorry, let me make that a 0. And let me change these so that the arrows are facing in the opposite direction. And I also want to get rid of that arrow. And I'll do the same for this one. And I will do the same for that one. So this is what your graph should look like if we have an increase in income for an inferior good. So we have the original equilibrium price, P0. I'm sorry, I have this one messed up a little bit. Let me fix this. So original equilibrium occurs where the original supply curve intersects the original demand curve, and that gives us our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. When we have an increase in income, a decrease in income, an increase in income for an inferior good, there's an inverse relationship between demand and the demand for an inferior good and income. So an increase in income will actually cause the demand curve to shift inward when we're talking about an inferior good. So this is the original demand. After the increase in income for an inferior good, the demand curve will shift to the left, and this will cause the new equilibrium price to be P1 and the equilibrium quantity to be Q1. So we would expect there to be a decrease in the price, equilibrium price, and a decrease in the equilibrium quantity. If we also take a look at the scenario where there's a decrease in income, for a normal good, your graph will look exactly the same. You'll have a upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve. That will give you your original equilibrium. Let me redo that. So we have our upward sloping supply curve, our downward sloping demand curve. That gives us our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. So if we have a decrease in income for a normal good, we know that they are positively related, meaning they move in the same direction. So a decrease in income for a normal good would cause the demand curve to shift to the left or shift inward. So we now have a new demand curve reflecting the fact that we have a lower level of income. The new equilibrium is going to occur where D1 intersects the original supply curve. So that gives us our new equilibrium price and quantity. And this decrease in income for the normal good will cause the equilibrium price and quantity to fall.